Welcome to episode 51 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hello there.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode. New ones are normally out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. And please do rate and review us and drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. Now it's time to introduce our featured topic and our guest for this episode.
If we've said it once, we've said it 1,000 times, or at least 51 times as our episode count indicates. But the threat landscape is ever changing. As we're more than halfway through 2021, which seems pretty crazy, we and our friends at SonicWall thought it would be a good idea to check in on the overall state of cyber threats.
Does news coverage accurately reflect the biggest areas of cybersecurity concern? Are there some under-the-radar hazards you should be looking out for? And what's changed in the last half year? We welcome a friend of the podcast, Brook Chelmo, back to discuss the mid-year update to SonicWall's 2021 Cyber Threat Report. Brook, thanks very much for joining us again.
Thank you. I think this is my fourth podcast with you, fifth podcast. I'm trying to take up at least 10% of your podcasts.
I think you might be at 10%. I think this might be 5. I didn't double check before, but
check my probation officer. Okay.
After 9 episodes, the 10th one is free. So.
Yes. That was 11. Okay.
Yeah. So talking about this report, we usually do go over each iteration of this, comes out about every 6 months. But before we jump into the contents specifically of this mid-year version, I wanted to take a step back and could you talk a little bit about just the level of effort that goes into putting this report together each time?
Yes. So we have dedicated people that focus on delivering this along with some third-party sources. But ultimately, it's something we do every 6 months where we gather the data. Our threat team, the Capture Labs team, which is continually looking at new threats, they're developing the signatures that go into static defense, and they're also developing the technology for dynamic defense with Capture ATP with RTDMI. This team is gathering that data all the time and then eventually prepping it, and then they follow through the same process. So it's for us, I think, I've been here for over 5 years, and this is probably jokingly my 11th threat report, possibly, if you include all the mid-years. And as a result, it's just a fun pleasure to kind of go through the data. And it's kind of eye-opening to see where things are going and how bad and how good things are getting.
Yeah. And as to the highlights or lowlights of this report, I guess. Let's just start with the big, expensive, high-profile elephant in the room, which is ransomware. So people following any kind of news coverage have obviously seen that there have been some major high-profile attacks. So do the numbers, the actual raw numbers, back this up as being the biggest problem right now?
Yeah. If you roll back to the 2021, beginning of the year threat report, which studied all the 2020 trends, we were up 62% over the year. When you take a look at the mid-year report, which just looks at from January 1st to June 30th, we're up 151%. With ransomware attacks being caught. We have an interesting customer. They're an MSSP. We have a lot of MSSPs. Our largest customers are distributed enterprises that are everywhere, anywhere, and MSSPs are among them. We have one that stopped a ransomware attack, and they're doing a case study with us and doing a webcast on August 11th. And in that experience, we learned that how bad it can get if you don't have things turned on or, you don't have things set up properly. And they've learned a lot from it. Thankfully, they're able to fight off the whole thing. But within minutes, the organization that was attacking them attempted over 4,000 attacks over 200 servers and endpoints. And that number is masked. It's a different number than that. It's a little bit higher than that, a lot higher than that, actually. But we're trying to hide the customer here. But the point being is that it's amazing on how things are trying to spread sideways and how aggressive it is, trying to get into server A and E and this endpoint and that endpoint, get into everything possible and try to encrypt it, whatever you can.
Right. And we've seen a lot of advancements in both the technology and the strategies behind ransomware as far as automation. You have these now double and triple threat types of ransomware with data exfiltration and DDoS attacks, things of that nature. So, I mean, is ransomware pretty much the new, is this going to be the next 10 years? Just watching this increase?
Yeah, if Gene Roddenberry had done a better job at forecasting what life would be like in space and, the whatever century it was or Star Trek, was set in, they would have had, instead of predicting all these mishaps with, the holodeck and other things and Klingons, they would have predicted a lot of ransomware attacks. That's my thought.
I don't know if that would have been as entertaining. Well, I mean, who knows?
Yeah, Picard goes and chases down the decryption code on the Romulan warship. You could do it. There's a way, and you know what? If the current people in charge of Star Trek are listening, let's make a ransomware episode, please.
Yeah, I mean, they're making a lot of different Star Treks right now, so we could look into that. Yeah,
the universe is large enough to fit the real problems that we're facing.
Maybe they find data locked in a closet, unable to move until they send some Bitcoin.
There we go. That would send the Bitcoin price into the stratosphere.
So looking at ransomware volume by region, pretty eye-opening numbers, especially in our side of the world here in North America, 180% increase, but even more shockingly so in Europe saw a 234% increase. Is there any particular rhyme or reason that sticks out to you why we're seeing such huge growth in Europe?
Well, it could be just that's where, the data is flowing at this point and why we're getting into that, why we're seeing that. Fundamentally, there could be some issues out there. I mean, hackers, for the most part, target vulnerabilities. They will target regions if they think that there is a specific, lucrative payout waiting somewhere, like a government agency. It could also be if they're using a very specific form of software that has a critical vulnerability. So it ebbs and flows. If they're anonymous hackers, then they're going to go after, regions based off of, what they feel are injustice, things like that. But I really don't have anything beyond, speculation at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, the chart kind of evokes, if you've been watching the Olympics at all, you see the medal chart and everything. And, the U.S. is far and away number one on the ransomware chart. So I guess that's some kind of an accomplishment, right?
Yeah, as Americans, I think we chase after the wrong targets. Let's focus on education and safety, right? Please. Okay.
But within the U.S., Andrew talks about the world picture, but within the U.S., Florida, for whatever reason, is sort of running away with it a little bit in terms of one of the states that's got the worst ransomware volume. Any thoughts on why Florida's sticking out above even like your traditional places like California?
Yeah, and I wish them the best. It's tough, and part of it could be if it's government locations. So sometimes, Florida stands out. So, I mean, they do get some hacktivist efforts sometimes and attention for what Florida does, and DeSantis will decide. So, I'm trying to get away from politics here and not making any statements. But the point being is that Florida could just be the luck of the draw right now. It could also be that, the state of Florida isn't, funding cybersecurity as well as, say, New York or Wisconsin. So that's the only speculation that I have at this point. But typically, when you do see an outlier, you first ask question one, is there a vulnerability that you could exploit? Which could mean, does Florida have older equipment that people know about that's showing up on showdown.io, right? Two is, have they done something to garner some attention, right? Was there a large Floridian city that paid out a ransomware? I don't know that specifically. There could have been. When cities pay, they have to report. That's the issue, right? Mm-hmm. And three, did they do something? I think I mentioned that. So I think that being said, that's where I would go if I'm going to speculate and write a white paper on this.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking volume now, but this threat report does have a new section on the idea of malware spread,
Yes.
which is a bit of a more per capita type metric, I suppose you would call it.
Yes.
So we are seeing in that spread that a lot of Asian countries are making the list. Is this maybe just a matter of them not having quite as many security sensors and data to pick up from those regions?
Yes, and I'm looking at the list here in terms of top spread, and this is the number of hits per network out there. So China, has 1.3 billion people. So the chart would be dwarfed if you include all the villagers and everything else in the country. This is based on the number of networks that we protect. And again, this is SonicWall's data from what SonicWall can see. SonicWall SonicWall doesn't sell a lot in China because, we're not a Chinese company. And so there's a disadvantage there. And, there are also some political issues too that happen with encryption, yada, yada, yada. So China tends to use more homebrewed solutions. So we do have a bit in China, which is why we're seeing, this pop up there. But that is also the issue. So for example, if I walk into someone's office and we're going to discuss a solution or a plan, and if I was able to go look at the loading dock, I may see, of course, SonicWall boxes, in the back room. I may see Fortinet, Palo Alto Networks boxes in the back. When I travel, and I do travel to third world countries because that's where people tend to send me because they would like to go to more developed countries to enjoy themselves. So I go to Colombia. I love it. I get to go to a lot of these places. And when I do walk in the front door and I do see my competitors' boxes, and largely I just see Huawei. And I see a lot of off-brand firewall boxes, things like this, where people are just selling, whatever's cheapest. And they're trying to do their best. And unfortunately, when you're in Vietnam or Sri Lanka, which is leading the chart, you typically don't have a lot of resource. You're doing your best and you're trying to go online. You're trying to, join everyone in the digital economy and trying to build a business. But the gross margins are narrow. The volume is small. So you have to do a lot more work to try to get by. And IT security becomes more of an afterthought instead of a forethought. So we're seeing a lot of these things. And it's not just the equipment they're buying, and they're buying the Huawei's and the kind of the cheap-o-matics that are out there. They're also understaffed, and they don't have the people to update critical vulnerabilities. They don't have the people to go there and develop internal programs or update their policies, etc. So there is a marked disadvantage for anyone like a Vietnam or a Sri Lanka or Brazil, or even, and look at the list here, Egypt, Romania is up there too. And we wish them the best. And, SonicWall is obviously here to try to provide them, one of the best values in the market for IT security and cybersecurity. But fundamentally, they're dealing with one less card in the hand, you could say.
And this chart that we're talking about with the malware spread is actually part of a, I guess, somewhat better news or shifting news scenario where the actual volume of malware has gone down, and especially in the US and the UK, some of the leading places. But malware itself is not being recorded as much as it used to be. Again, maybe just shifting to different ways to carry out cybercrime. But is another reason why maybe the spread is higher in these places because just the evolution of what's popular where and that sort of thing?
It could be. Again, it's largely the malware spread tends to hit these countries more. And if you take a look at malware spread based on vertical, it's also government that tends to get the higher amount of spread. And if there is a target, it's usually because they feel that it's weaker. And again, no one's like, hey, I want to go see what I can hack in the Czech Republic this week. That only happens if you have some type of vendetta, like I discussed in my Russian hacker one, where they have a vendetta against Germans and Americans. Now, in the case of how this is usually happening is that these, attacking organizations are they're pinging IPs for vulnerabilities. And if there's a specific vulnerability that they can find, then they're going to go after that. And then, it happens to be that it's in Egypt, or it happens to be in Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos. So that's typically how I would explain away why a country gets more of a spread, especially when we're looking at the data and it shows us that we're in a much more targeted environment. So, and it's not really targeted where, one wakes up and says, I want to go see what I can find in, downtown Hanoi. It's more or less, what vulnerability can I find out there by picking a range of IP addresses.
And so speaking of malware getting on the decline a little bit, I think one kind of good news piece in this report is talking about PDF and Office files that are afflicted going down. I mean, we talked even fairly recently about malicious PDFs and docs and things like that being still a pretty big issue, but it seems like all of a sudden in 2021, that's dropped.
Yeah. So there is always going to be a change up and down. And I don't have the actual numbers in front of me of what the number of critical vulnerabilities that were within Microsoft's ecosystem. Obviously, the larger it gets and the more they develop, the higher that's going to be. So, we're going to see the ebb and flow. There's no such thing as 100% growth or, continuous growth that happens on the same line and the same curve. For example, I don't expect ransomware to go as high as we're seeing it's going to be on the curve, but it's going to ebb and flow. Microsoft was the doll baby that they're all playing with. Interestingly, the MSSP that was attempted to be encrypted by the ransomware, they won. They fought it off. They were infected by a fake form of Excel.
Well, while we're on the topic of malware and good news, it looks as though in February of this year, SonicWall's Capture ATP got a 100% score with no false positives on a advanced threat defense testing from ICSA. Was that a change in technology in any way, or more so just the system and the sort of environment and database of threats growing and becoming more mature over time?
Yeah, I would probably attribute that to that. Also, the Capture Labs team does a lot of work on this one. So RTDMI is the underlying technology that's been put behind Capture ATP for the last 3 years or so, if I remember right. And that requires a lot of tweaks. And I do get a lot of questions, and I have to help with RFQs on occasion. And I get questions from a lot of government agencies like, so tell me, or also award agencies like an ICSA and these types of testing organizations will say, what developments have you gone through? Well, RTDMI doesn't go through the same kind of 0.1, 0.2, or 2.0, 3.0 type of a release style, or kind of the agile development of that kind of underlying technology. It's continuously improved. Part of it is the machine learning algorithm that's maturing, chewing on more stuff every single day. But it's also the team too, also scrubbing out the false positives. So with the ICSA test, it was really encouraging that we had 100% detection of all things malicious and a 0% false positive rate, which is extremely rare to find. So with that being said, it's a mixture of the tools and technology maturing, plus the team also continuously developing that. Now, when you do see that 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 type typical agile release, and that, the way that we enumerate software releases, that's where you see that in the firewalls and the Sonic OS, as well as CSA. That's where we see that actual number change. So if you want to track the development based on its version of the software, that's where you track it there. But RTDMI receives a lot of updates without kind of the fanfare or actually enumerating the development of that technology.
Well, and another number associated with RTDMI in this first half of 2021 was a pretty big increase in detecting those never before seen threats that we've talked about before.
Mm-hmm. So that's the one thing too, is that, SonicWall's RTDMI, that means real time deep memory inspection. In the first half of the year, discovered 186,000 new forms of malware. That's a 54% increase from year to date over the year before that. So like I mentioned before, I believe we're in a much more targeted environment where we've seen malware drop. The malware drop again was last year 40 some percent over year. And in this year, the first half of this year, we're talking about a 22% decrease in overall malware attacks that we're seeing. So we're seeing that spread fall. We're seeing the overall malware attacks drop. But yet when we see that RTDMI, real-time deep memory inspection, is catching more and more and more at a much greater rate, and ICSA gives it a 0% false positive rate, that shows you that, we are in this new targeted environment where someone will, again, ping a range of IP addresses. They'll go on showdown.io and they'll pick a list of products that they want to go try to manipulate or to get past. Go in there and then customize the malware to go and spread around the organization or update it so that it looks different to static defenses. Then RTDMI is picking that up again. A 54% increase over the year of the first half of this year is alarming.
It's been interesting the last couple months of this show talking about the rise of ransomware and sort of how and why it's being executed, and seeing how much it ties into the news cycle and politics and all these different business decisions out there. And we're seeing much the same thing in the crypto jacking, which is also up 23% according to their support. I assume that's just tied directly to the value of cryptocurrencies going at such a great spike recently.
Yeah. So with crypto jacking, the story is, what is the value of cryptocurrency? Because you are mining it directly with other people's devices, essentially. So it's after CoinHive shut down, it really put it into a lull, but people have been reactivating and weaponizing different forms of crypto miners to make those as a form of malware. So CoinHive didn't need to go away for this to come back, right? Or to stop it from coming back. So in the case of crypto jacking, again, the price is tied directly to the value of the cryptocurrency. But typically how we're looking at this is that we're seeing probably, because I mean, we did have kind of a lull in price, what's Bitcoin at today? I haven't checked that, but it was at 61,000 at the top of the market.
We're around like 40,000 right now, a little under.
Yeah, and I think that the old voice like Elon Musk are coming back to try to give some time and attention to Dogecoin, etc. So we're going to see prices coming back now that guys like Elon are back in the boat and stop playing with the price of cryptocurrency. So that being said, I think they're speculating at this point. If they're going to put the time and the effort to make this botnet to try to garner more and more you could say funds here, I think largely it's because they expect that price to come back up very soon where they can really cash in.
Almost like a black stock market where they're kind of predicting cryptocurrency futures.
Yeah, there's interesting stories and how things are being done up there. And the price of cryptocurrency is largely manipulated by we call Bitcoin whales, or these cryptocurrency whales. These are the people who accumulated a lot of Bitcoin in the early days and are now using it as a weapon to manipulate the price and drive up the price by buying it this way, selling it off in droves to drive it down the other way, and basically become wealthier and wealthier. And there is a large pool of stolen Bitcoin that all the different exchanges are basically have block listed where they will not trade that currency. But what will happen is that the hackers will have different wallets. They'll go and drop the cryptocurrency from one wallet and put it into the other, largely for the sake of forcing Bitcoin to tank, not tank, but to drop a bit, and they'll make their money on the speculation or on buying puts against Bitcoin. So it's amazing on how intelligent these people are and how they know that they have the ability and power to just sway the markets by just moving stolen Bitcoin from one blocked wallet to another blocked wallet.
Interesting.
And one other point that I know we've discussed non-standard ports before as being a sort of key attack vector, but it seems like that, according to this update to the report, non-standard ports have not been attacked as much as of late.
Yeah, which is a surprise to me because that metric has been very static for quite some time. It was roughly 20% of all attacks came through non-standard ports. In the last, I should say Q2 of 2021, it was 13% of all non-standard ports were seeing these attacks. So it probably just could be more, stuff coming from standard HTTP, HTTPS ports with more drive-by attacks or more watering hole attacks. I'm not exactly sure what that would be or where we're getting that drop, but it is encouraging. I do expect it to go back up. The VNC ports are considered non-standard ports. It's 5900, 5901. Those ones are attacked religiously by ransomware authors because that they want to spread sideways and get to other, places, which is why directory traversal was the number one kind of an intrusion tactic that was used by malware at 34% if you just gave one tactic to each malware. But with that being said, it'll come back, and you do need to keep a focus on inspecting those ports and inspecting the traffic that comes through them.
Before we let you go, tell us a little bit more about how people can get in on the webinar you discussed a little bit earlier about the MSSP.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the company, the MSSP that we're referring to is called CMIT of Metrolina. They're a franchisee of CMIT Solutions. They had this big attack. The president of CMIT Solutions of Metrolina and their service delivery manager, Joseph Little, will be actually telling the story of how they fought this off and the lessons that they learned. So for them, it was the defense in depth kind of story really stuck out and really helped them. And what happened was they had a customer that they service receive this email from someone who was driving at the time saying, "Hey, I can't see this email right now. I can't see this." And it was like a complaint of some sort from a trusted partner, what they thought was a trusted partner. And the lady tried to print it out. And she did, of course, what a lot of victims do, and that is enable macros so she could see the content. And I have a picture of the actual malware. And it says, there's a warning that Microsoft put there. It says, "This was not made in Microsoft Office." And she went and enabled it anyways. And it's, it was on PC, I think 73 is what they call it. And from that moment, it quickly mapped the entire network within seconds. And then, within minutes was already trying to attack every server and endpoint that was, out there in the marketplace. And so, the webcast will have a graphic that will explain the whole attack story. Joseph and Emery will kind of go through there and talk about it. But ultimately at the end, they learned a lot of lessons. Like, how do we turn this on or how do we turn that on? How had we had capture client block the threat once it was detected instead of having us decide, then we would have missed this whole story. Had we used CAS, because it was a cloud-based email account that got the attack, it would have most likely stopped the attack even coming into the inbox, so we wouldn't even have the webcast. But the point is that they're going to get into the nitty-gritty and tell the dirty details on what happened, what they did to stop it, and about 5 lessons that they learned and the changes that they've made to their organization as a result. And I expect this one, we already have close to 800 attendees that have signed up to be there. It's on Bright Talk. You just find it on our socials. Maybe you can include it in a link in the podcast somewhere. Yep. But so we can do that. So we expect this to be kind of, for me at least, the podcast of the year for us.
Great, and looking forward to that. August 11th, you said?
That's correct.
All right, Brook, thanks very much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me. All 5, 6, 7, 8 times.
See you next time.
We always appreciate it. Thanks.
You got it.
Now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at the top stories in the cybersecurity world and talk about what they may mean to you. Now, headline number 1. A controversial tool calls out thousands of hackable websites. The controversial tool is called Punk Spider, and it crawls hundreds of millions of sites for vulnerabilities. At the DEF CON Hacker Conference later this week, as our episode drops, Alejandro Caceres and Jason Hopper plan to release, or rather to re-release, a tool called Punk Spider.
Yeah, when you say re-release, this is actually not the first time we've seen Punk Spider. Several years ago, it might have been about a decade ago, a first version, I guess, maybe a prototype you might call it, of this was released, and it didn't have quite the same features, but now this new version is able to crawl millions of websites every single day, just kind of constantly on the search out there, sort of like a Google crawler bot, just out there on the web, crawling websites, testing things, trying MySQL attacks, things like that, and just trying to find what they call low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so it's a two-pronged thing because it's fuzzing all these sites, which is basically poking and prodding for these vulnerabilities. And if it finds them, it actually goes a step further and allows anyone to search the results that they come up with to find which sites are showing these vulnerabilities.
Right, and this is where the big controversy comes in, is when these vulnerabilities are found, they are, sounds like, immediately released to the public in this sort of searchable format where pretty much like a search engine, you go on and you can look for keywords, URLs, different types of vulnerabilities, and see what sites out there are potentially exposed.
Yeah, and the search tool, and it also has a browser plugin option too, if you're so inclined. They give every website a dumpster fire score of 1 to 5 dumpster fires, depending on how many vulnerabilities each site contains and how serious those vulnerabilities are. So I think you probably don't want to have a 5 dumpster fire score.
Right. So there's opinions to be had on this story, and I think perhaps the dumpster fire score is, for me, what kind of tipped this over into the negative side of things. I think at that point they're actively looking to be adversarial if they're specifically giving it that kind of naming convention, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the idea, according to the founder, Caceres in particular is interviewed in this piece, sounds noble enough. But yeah, it seems like there is a bit of an adversarial edge to the way that it's being approached.
Right. So his argument is that if all of this is public and, customers, users out there can go find your website and see that it's vulnerable and have that information, then that puts pressure on these companies to sort of secure themselves better. I think the issue comes in with the timing and accessibility, because there are other sites out there that are actively crawling the web looking for vulnerabilities just like this. But when they find them, they notify the companies first and give them some lead time to actually try to attempt to fix the issue before they make it public.
Yeah. Now, the argument in favor of this approach is that a lot of those places that have found vulnerabilities already, they're known vulnerabilities that haven't been patched over quite a while. Things that have happened in the last year or two or more that have come up. but not always patched. So Caceres is arguing that by sort of threatening them with this immediate exposure, it might spur the administrators of these sites that have some of these ongoing longer-term vulnerabilities on them to take action.
Right. So there's always been this sort of push-pull. Whose fault is it ultimately? Is it the attackers or the companies not securing themselves? Is it the customers not making themselves more aware of the vulnerabilities out there? This is choosing a target and laying the blame pretty firmly, I think. So
yeah.
I don't 100% know how I feel about it. I've kind of thought about different metaphors in my brain that none of them quite fit. I don't know that I'd be comfortable if somebody published a list of all of the Americans that left their doors unlocked at home, but I'm also not a customer of those people's doors, so I might want to know that if I had something valuable stored in those houses.
That's true.
But for me, the thing that really sticks out is sort of jumping to the very end of the story is this quote from Caceres where he says, "If I created a monster here, it's because I had to try something." And to me, that comes across as something the mad scientist says while watching his monster destroy the town. So, in cybersecurity, defense has always been harder than offense, and I kind of feel like this is putting another tool in the offensive's bag. I see the argument on both sides, and I'm not 100% sold either way, but I'm leaning currently towards maybe there's a wiser way to do this.
It may be a situation where this idea needs some massaging from some other folks and more collaboration, and maybe even put in the hands of either a more established security kind of company or maybe even government kind of opportunity where there's some sort of collaboration to still go about identifying these vulnerabilities, but maybe finding a way to do so in either a more discreet fashion or just in a fashion that allows for collaboration to be occurring throughout this process and not necessarily super flagging those places that are that
Right.
not only left their doors unlocked but might have left them open overnight.
Right. So, who knows? Maybe we're wrong. Maybe this will turn some things around and people will feel the pressure and start to improve security. But I think really we're, as sort of been the subject matter of the last several episodes now, this is potentially a legislation problem more so than just people throwing mud at each other situation.
Yeah, and these creators are going to be presenting at this edition of DEF CON, so it might be worth following to see how that's received and what, if any, steps come after that. Now, headline number 2, BlackMatter and Haron, evil ransomware newborns or rebirths? Before we get into this story, if you do follow the link in the description, prepare yourself for some disturbing imagery.
Yeah, trigger warning for a very scary baby.
Yes.
if that's your thing.
It is safe for work, but maybe not safe for your dreams
Right.
or nightmares. Anyway, so much for darkened servers at the headquarters of DarkSide or Revil ransomware groups. It turns out we may either have rebranded versions of both of them or two new ransomware gangs that share some striking similarities with the two of them.
Right, so Ars Technica's Dan Gooden, one of several people that have been looking into these groups. These are pretty much brand new ransomware networks supposedly being launched, and they were registered on some Russian language hacking sites, the biggest of which I believe was Exploit. And so far, based on the ransom notes, the open source code that they've had some chances to look at, as well as the negotiation website where people are being sent as victims, this kind of looks like a copy-paste job, either just sort of recycling someone else's work, or maybe it's the same people with a new name.
Yes, so two examples being touted here. Haron will start with first, and it's sharing a lot with a different ransomware as a service provider that I don't think we had really talked about very much, Avedon. And that one is one of those providers that did sort of disappear back in June with the Colonial Pipeline hack, which is sort of the precipitating incident for a lot of these big ones to have gone underground. But anyway, this Haron ransomware is sharing quite a bit of the copy-paste verbiage in their letters and their verbiage on their websites, the negotiation sites looking almost exactly the same, as you said, the open source code and structure of the sites. So there are a few changes between Haron and Avedon, which could suggest that maybe there's just some sort of tangential similarity rather than a direct rebirth. But definitely a possibility there.
Yeah, so for example, the Haron ransomware now has a negotiation time of 6 days, whereas Abaddon allowed 10 days for negotiation. And it seems that some of the programming was written in a different language than Abaddon. So potentially this is a different group that just got lazy with the front-facing part of the ransomware. But at the same time, it could just be, they're using it as a stopping point to rebrand some things, rewrite some things, and, reform.
Yeah, and another key difference is that Haron is not so far showing signs of doing the triple threat attack play, which is something we talked about recently. The 3 layers, basically, where you encrypt the data locally, also steal the data, exfiltrate it before making that ransom demand, and also threaten a DDoS attack until the victim actually follows through with paying the ransom. So that triple threat thing hasn't happened yet with Haron, so that's another difference between the two. But yeah, the folks who have been analyzing this have basically found no solid proof that it's definitely the same people behind it, but certainly a possibility.
Right, and this second ransomware group that is supposedly new is called BlackMatter, and they are very much similar vein as groups like DarkSide or REvil, and are claiming that they will not be attacking certain industries that they feel are off limits. So this is a ransomware as a service thing, it sounds like, but they've put some restrictions on themselves.
Yes, and the similar restrictions to the dark side lists that we heard before and the REvil lists in the past too. So you got hospitals, critical infrastructure facilities, pipelines and other oil and gas facilities, defense industry, government, nonprofit, all of those things. They don't mention schools, actually, which is kind of interesting because...
back on the menu.
Yeah. But it seems like some of these choices on here are based on the backlash to some ransomware attacks of recent vintage. And so maybe if the news coverage of that kind of thing died down a bit, the list would change too. But that's an interesting similarity and certainly could be explained just by the fact that it could be a new group that already saw some issues with previous actions and they're going that direction. Or maybe it's the same group and they care about those issues.
Right. Another reason we might not see schools, education industry on that list is because according to these groups, their targets are going to be large companies, enterprises that have revenues of over 100 million. I think they're looking to sort of hone in their focus here on people that are able to pay the ransom and more likely will just to get back to business as usual. So large companies they're hoping to get their fingers into.
Yeah, pay the ransom and pay big. I think you could probably find some school districts that have a budget big enough to
That's true.
potentially afford that.
At least the football department.
Yeah. Not making any suggestions here, but,
right.
But yeah. That goes back to the first story, and we don't want to start opening doors. But in any case, this is interesting because it does follow that trend of having sort of the list, and in this case, the quote-unquote big fish, as noted in this story. They actually speak with a cybersecurity pro, Sean Nickel from Digital Shadows, in this threat post piece. And he notes that the careful selection of big companies reflects the increasing number of threat actors that are, quote, doing their due diligence when it comes to selecting victims. Again, trying to stay a little bit more under the radar, go directly to these companies that probably want discretion on their own as well, and instead of dealing with stuff that could get into governments and news and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that's a bit of a sticking point that got in my brain when I was thinking about this, how you can, on the one hand, say you won't be attacking critical infrastructure or oil and gas defense industries, but you will be going up the supply chain to places like Kaseya or SolarWinds. Obviously, those places are going to be using those tools, so they're still getting affected one way or the other.
Seems not a little their fault, though, right?
Yeah, so this article uses the word virtue signaling a lot, and shout out to the author here. I'd say the whole tone of this article is kind of just one big eye roll. So yeah, I enjoyed that aspect of it. Thank you to the writer there.
One last note, BlackMatter's leak site so far is currently empty, so that suggests that they have not actually carried out any attacks as of yet, but it's only launched this week as we record this, so late July. So we'll see if that leak site starts to change and if we start to hear some news about attacks relating to this ransomware cell. Time for headline number 3. 1/3 of cybersecurity workers have faced harassment at work or online, and this initiative aims to stamp it out. What is this initiative?
This initiative is called Respect in Security. So, as you said, they found that 32% of the 302 people they surveyed have experienced some sort of harassment online via email, LinkedIn, Twitter, or other social media platforms. And this seems to be sort of a bit of a cyberbullying thing as well as a sexual harassment thing mentioned throughout the article.
And even an in-person issue, too, because the survey also found 35% of these cybersecurity pros have said they experienced some form of harassment in person at industry events, in work socials, or even at the office. So it sort of follows on to some things that we've talked about before, in that there's a perception, at least out there, and maybe a little bit accurate based on the survey, that cybersecurity, the field, is a little bit of a boys' club per se.
And I know we've mentioned probably a dozen times on this podcast now how badly the industry's hurting to hire people. So, the less bristly it can get, probably in the best interest of everyone involved.
You would think, yeah. And this is a two-pronged issue, because if people see that this is a problem in the industry, then they're less likely to be interested in joining said career field. But also, they point out, the co-founder of Respect in Security, Rick Ferguson, in this piece points out that he thinks people would walk away and be put off, deterred from entering it, based on the amount of or lack of respect for certain folks in the industry.
Right. So what this Respect in Security initiative is actually aiming to do is encouraging organizations in the InfoSec industry, as well as other cybersecurity teams, so imagine nonprofits, profits as well, all around the board, to sign pledges, basically to promise to be more tolerant and respectful in the industry.
Yeah, it's largely creating some sort of an honor system, and also raising awareness of the issue, hopefully maybe putting it out front and center, rather than having people sort of whisper about it or keep issues that have come up to themselves, which seems like a good idea, because, yeah, it's not something you should have to deal with just doing your job.
Yeah, we are all adults just trying to work our jobs so we can go home and pet our dogs and fall asleep on the couch or whatever, and you don't really want to have to deal with this stuff on a day-to-day basis. So if you are a bully of any sort out there, just stop.
Yeah, and Ferguson actually says this is a broad industry-wide issue affecting men and women, people of all sexual orientations, people of all skin colors. So just about everybody is dealing with this in some way, shape, or form. And we'll see what really comes of this, certainly if there are any teeth behind the pledge, too, whether we see places take this pledge, and if there's some sort of violation occurring, what's done about it? Will it sort of publicly shame the organization that allows this sort of behavior to continue? Or, I don't know, there are a lot of questions, but at least it's a first step.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't just a sort of honor system completely. A second part of this is meant to set up a sort of external policy system where, if these types of harassments are taking place, we would like these companies to be able to have a mechanism to report and remedy those. So there's a bit more depth than just saying we promise to be good boys. There is some actual infrastructure and planning going forward to start making this a more reportable and easily sortable process.
Yeah, they're actually comparing it. Ferguson compares it to a vulnerability claim procedure. And so setting up contact information, setting up maybe forms to fill out to report things, just to make it easier for people to report if an issue has occurred with them. And the other co-founder of this we haven't mentioned is Lisa Forte. And she says, as an industry, we spend a lot of time online, and probably a lot more so than other industries. So I think in that respect, we are quite unique in that we are more exposed to some of the online stuff. And yeah, I mean,
as we all know, the internet can be a very mean place.
Very much so. And a lot of that is based on people being avatars of themselves who may not use their names and be front and center, but the fact that it's out there and sort of directed at the InfoSec field suggests that it's a problem that may be even more specific to this.
Right.
Thanks for listening to this edition of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, and thanks very much to Brook Chelmo for joining us. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now, however you listen, to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon soon as they're available, and please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs, and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode, but in the meantime, we remind you to
Get secure, stay secure.